Hey everyone, I thought today I would do something a little bit different and talk about the concept of permaculture and whether or not it's a climate solution. Um, I want to say right off the top, I'm assuming that you believe in climate change if you've made it this far. If you don't, great. Continue along your worldview of cognitive dissonance. Enjoy. For everyone else, I think it's helpful to think about climate change from multiple different angles and make it into something that we can actually understand on a more localized and personal level. Although it is, of course, we say climate change, but there's many climate changes. There's many different climate crises that are unfolding, and exactly what it means for each of us looks a little bit different. Another thing that I think is important to understand before talking about the benefits of something like permaculture is to understand that there is no one solution to climate change, of course, and that ultimately the need to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and curb carbon emissions is by far the most important thing that we can do. Without that, it doesn't matter what systems we put in place, we are not going to reach any of our climate goals, and we are going to continue down a very, very scary path. However, I do think it's important to have hope and to be able to think about and dream about possibilities. And again, experience that, have something in our day-to-day lives that we can experience as climate resilience and adaptation and functioning ecosystems. So the whole idea of permaculture is a design approach and way of thinking. And in many ways, it's a repackaging of millennia-old knowledge and traditions, largely from indigenous worldviews, that look at systems rather than parts of systems. Traditional agriculture tends to think about things in terms of monocultures and one crop of one thing. And so as we walk around the beautiful Van Dusen Gardens in Vancouver, BC here, showing you some examples of ecosystems thriving together. Now, this is a very planned out park and garden space, and is not necessarily designed to be a permaculture system, but it's nice to look at while we talk about the horrors of climate change. So, understanding that permaculture is a systems type of thinking and a design approach where we look at all of the different elements and how they work together to create an ecosystem, not just for plants and animals, but also for people. So it's combining the idea of permanence, something that is sustainable and ongoing, and culture, which includes culturing of plants and animals, but of course also people and communities. A thing that I've experienced and seen a lot of about permaculture resources is they really talk a lot about food systems, and that's great, but there's also been a huge uptake by this sort of like back to the landers and homesteader movements that can very quickly turn something back into a system about, well, how do we make the most money off of this? And that's the way that we can survive. And myself and many others would argue that permaculture is a system for generating community wealth, and wealth in a much more open and expansive definition than just having a permaculture farm that is suddenly raking in huge profits. Most good permaculture resources talk about how to even be thinking about, even if you are making money, which is fine, how to make sure that you're putting profits back into the community and providing for people beyond just charging money for food. Anyway, already we're starting to go down all the different tangents of permaculture and the many great things and the many not so great things about it and its different interpretations. But I want to come back to this idea of systems, and that ultimately one of the things that we face with climate change is the breakdown of systems. Where we see the worst ravages of climate change tend to be in places where native species have been removed, where we've dredged up lakes to create farmland, where there's been massive deforestation and complex ecosystems have been bulldozed and maybe replanted, but replanted with one species of tree. That particular species of tree might now be more susceptible to pests. Pests are becoming a bigger problem because of climate change, as are droughts. And so you can see how something like a forest that goes from a thriving ecosystem of many different types of ages and species of plants all working together, when that gets bulldozed and just turned into a mountain slope of one tree, the problems can become much greater, much quicker. So permaculture encourages us to think about how things are working together and trying to provide as many different connections between species as possible. That's where I think permaculture and ideas like permaculture can really be a positive step forward for people in adapting to climate change. Regardless of what happens in the future in terms of environmental policy, we know climate change is here to stay. While we are alive and while our children are alive, we know we're going to be dealing with some pretty serious stuff as a result of climate change. And so we need to be thinking about how we interact with climate change and how we try to push for positive things moving forward from multiple different angles. But in terms of our local context, I think permaculture gives us the opportunity to think about, well, how can we create more connections between things right here, right now, so that when some of those unanticipated and anticipated things happen because of climate change, we're a little bit better prepared. So I think one relatively and overly simplistic way of thinking about climate change is whatever your current climate is and whatever weather extremes you're experiencing now, expect those to increase. The extremes will become more extreme. And if you have certain characteristics, like you tend to have hot, dry summers, anticipate that those summers will become hotter and drier. By extension, if you traditionally have really rainy and wet winters, you can probably expect even rainier and wetter winters as well. So climate change is affecting all of these different complex systems, and that means that we can, to some degree, anticipate some changes, but we can't anticipate all changes. That's where I think thinking through things in terms of connections and really trying to create as much diversity as possible is ultimately going to be a far more resilient food system for people moving forward. As we've seen throughout the last couple of years, all it takes is one major global event or the invasion of a country to suddenly throw off a really staple crop of food. And without going down the rabbit hole of food security, which we'll definitely get to in other videos, all of a sudden these complex supply chain systems that we're so tired of hearing about, those break down as well. And so all of these movements, the 100-mile diet, farm to table, homesteading, permaculture, no-dig, all of these things I think ultimately are trying to achieve very similar aims through different means. And that's to try to create more resilient food systems closer to where people live. There's all kinds of economic benefits to that, of course, social benefits, as well as health benefits. In terms of where do we go from here and how do we move forward, I think like you probably, I still have lots of questions, and there's so many different types of systems and ways of thinking and approaches to gardening and growing food and farming. It can be really difficult to know where to start. I found it really helpful to start with some of my questions and then beginning to research different lines of inquiry into those questions. One of the big questions I have right now is the role of pollinators. I know that bees are really important. We hear lots about providing homes for pollinators. I really want to know more about how do pollinators fit in with the overall ecosystem of growing food, but also just growing plants in general. So providing things like strips of wildflowers to attract pollinators, because those are actually often species that bees prefer over some of the traditional agricultural crops that we might plant. Anyway, these are all things that are in my head, and really this whole channel I've wanted to just be as a way for me to explore these questions, for me to learn as well. I'm by no means an expert on any of this. I'm trusting that if you found this content and you've stuck around this far, you also have some of the same questions I do. And I'll continue to do my best to help work through some of those together.